My name is Thomas Reed. I am 31 years old and I run a small apple orchard on the south side of Millbrook Valley, Montana. 40 acres of it, most of it trees, with a strip of pasture I lease to a neighboring rancher for his horses, and a creek that runs cold and clear along the eastern boundary from April through October. The house is old, timber framed, 2 stories, with a porch that faces west so the evenings hit it right. My grandfather planted the first trees here in 1961. My father kept them going. I inherited the whole operation 7 years ago when my father died of a heart attack in the middle of May, right at the start of the picking season, which is about the cruelest timing the land can offer a man. I kept the orchard going because it was what I knew, and because letting it fail felt like losing him twice. I learned the rest as I went. How to manage the cold storage, how to negotiate with the co-op in town, how to read weather in the way orchard men have to read it, not just for today, but for 3 weeks from now when the blossoms are out and one late frost can take everything you spent a year preparing for. I learned to do all of it alone because there was no one else to do it with me. And after enough seasons of that, alone stopped feeling like a temporary situation and started feeling like just the way things were. The Alderman family lived 2 miles north of me on the Valley Road. Owen Alderman had been my father's friend before he was mine. He ran a small dairy operation, kept a large kitchen garden, and had the kind of laugh that carried across a field in a way that made you want to know what was funny. His wife Helen made preserves that people drove an hour to buy. They had 1 daughter. Her name was June. I had known June Alderman the way you know people in a small valley, well enough to wave at on the road, well enough to ask after her parents, well enough to recognize her truck before I could see the driver. She left Millbrook for college in Missoula 6 years ago, and then stayed on afterward working for an agricultural nonprofit that helped small family farms with grant applications and financial planning. She came home for holidays. Sometimes I saw her at the feed store or the diner when she was visiting. She always looked like someone who had somewhere to be, capable and settled in herself in a way that people who have built a life outside their hometown sometimes carry, like a kind of quiet confidence. I never thought much about her beyond that. She was Owen's daughter. She was good people. She lived somewhere else. That was the whole of it for a long time. She came back to Millbrook for good in August of that year. I heard it from Owen when I stopped by to drop off a crate of early apples I had promised him. He mentioned it the way you mention weather, matter-of-factly, like it was simply a thing that had happened. Said June had decided to come home. Said she was going to run her nonprofit work remotely and help Helen with the garden and the preserves operation, which had grown bigger than Helen could manage alone. Said she seemed glad to be back, even if she hadn't said so in those exact words. I nodded and loaded the empty crate back in the truck and drove home and didn't think about it again for 2 weeks. The first time I actually spoke to her properly was at the Millbrook Valley Harvest Supper in late September. I had gone after all, partly because Owen had asked me directly, and I couldn't think of a reason to say no that didn't sound worse than just going, and partly because my neighbor Walt had offered to check the cattle that evening, which removed my last practical excuse. The supper was held at the Alderman place that year, long tables in the barn with the doors thrown open to the evening air, lanterns strung along the beams, enough food to last 3 days. Half the valley was there. I ate, talked to the men I usually talked to about prices and weather and equipment, and was considering leaving at a respectable hour when Owen appeared at my elbow and said there was someone he wanted me to talk to about the co-op pricing situation because she knew more about agricultural cooperative structures than anyone he'd met. That was how he introduced us. Not as his daughter, as someone who knew things worth knowing. June was standing near the far end of the barn with a plate in one hand and a conversation already going with 2 of the older farmers from the north end of the valley. She was tall, brown hair down, wearing a flannel shirt and work boots, and she was in the middle of explaining something about state agricultural subsidy structures with the focused patience of someone who had explained it many times before and genuinely did not mind explaining it again. When Owen brought me over, she finished her point, then turned and looked at me with the direct, steady gaze of a person who sizes people up quickly and does it without making them feel sized up. Owen said, "June, this is Thomas Reed. His family runs the orchard on the south end. He's been getting squeezed by the co-op pricing on his storage grades for 2 seasons." June looked at me. She said, "Which grades and what percentage differential?" I told her. She asked 2 more questions, specific and practical, and then told me there was a state program I almost certainly qualified for that would offset the difference and that she could send me the application materials if I wanted. Not if you're interested or you might want to look into it. Just a clean direct offer like handing someone a tool they needed. I said I'd appreciate that. She went back to the other conversation. I stood there for a moment feeling like I had just been efficiently and not unkindly processed, and then went to find more apple cider. But I thought about her on the drive home. Not in any particular way. Just the directness of her. The way she had asked about grades and percentages before she asked anything else. The way she clearly knew her subject and did not perform knowing it. The application materials arrived in my email inbox 2 days later with a short note that said the deadline was November 15th and that she was happy to answer questions if I got stuck on any of the sections. I filled out the forms. I did get stuck on 2 sections. I sent her the questions. She answered them the same day, clearly and without condescension. I submitted the application. 3 weeks later, I received a notice that I had been approved for a subsidy that would save the orchard roughly $4,000 in the coming season. I drove over to the Alderman place to tell Owen and to say thank you to June. Owen was out checking the far pasture. Helen invited me in for coffee. June was at the kitchen table with a laptop and a stack of folders. She looked up when I came in and I told her about the approval. She said good, genuinely, like she was actually glad it had worked out, and then said there was a second program she thought I should look at for cold storage infrastructure that would be relevant when I eventually needed to replace the compressors. I sat down at the kitchen table because Helen had put coffee in front of me, and it seemed rude to leave immediately, and June slid a printout across the table with the relevant sections already highlighted. We sat in Helen's kitchen for an hour. We talked about the orchard and the co-op, and then about the valley in general, and how small agricultural operations were surviving or not surviving in this part of Montana, which was something June had clear opinions about based on years of working with farms in similar situations. She talked about it the way my father used to talk about apple varieties, with the specific affection of someone who had chosen their subject carefully and meant to stay with it. When I finally stood up to leave, Helen was smiling in the doorway in a way that I chose not to examine too closely. I drove home thinking that June Alderman was one of the most practically useful people I had met in several years, and that this was an underrated quality in a person. October moved the way October does in Montana. Cold mornings, bright afternoons, the aspen on the North Ridge going yellow, the last of the picking coming in. I was busy from before light until after dark most days, but I found myself stopping at the Alderman place more often than I had before. Sometimes, with a reason, dropping off a box of seconds for Helen's preserves, asking Owen about his pasture lease terms. Sometimes without much reason at all, except that it had become a place I did not mind being. June was usually there. She worked from home most mornings, drove into town for meetings 2 or 3 times a week, helped Helen in the afternoons with the preserve operation that had expanded into a small commercial kitchen in the barn. She was always doing something. I never saw her idle in a way that looked restless. She had the particular stillness of someone who knew how to be where they were without needing it to be somewhere else. We started talking more. Not about agricultural programs. About things. About the valley and the way it had changed since we were children, and the ways it had not changed at all. About what she had liked and not liked about the city. About what I had liked and not liked about never leaving. She asked good questions, the kind that assumed you had thought about things, which made you want to actually think about them before answering. One afternoon in mid-October, I was walking the east boundary of the orchard, checking the creek level after a run of heavy rain, when I found a section of my fence line down into the Alderman property, posts pulled out of the soft bank by the water. I spent 2 hours resetting the posts in the rain. When I finally got the last one tamped and the wire run, I turned around and June was standing on the Alderman side of the fence with a canvas jacket over her shoulders and a thermos in her hand. She said, "Mom saw you from the kitchen window. She sent coffee." I was soaked through, and my hands were cold enough that I had trouble with the thermos lid. June opened it without comment and handed it back. We stood on either side of the fence in the rain while I drank the coffee, and the creek ran brown and fast a few feet below us. She looked at the repair. She said, "You do this every year?" I said the bank softened when the water ran high and pulled the post loose. Said I had been meaning to put in a proper concrete footer on this section for 3 years and kept not getting to it. She looked at the water. She said, "My dad has a power auger in the equipment shed. If you wanted to do it properly before the ground freezes, you could probably get it done this week." I looked at her. She was watching the creek with a practical expression, like she was simply solving a problem that was in front of her. The same way she had asked about grades and percentages the first night I met her. I said I would appreciate borrowing the auger. She said she would let Owen know. Then she said, "I'll help if you want an extra set of hands." I looked at her again. She met my eyes directly the way she always did, and there was nothing in her expression except the straightforward offer of someone who knew how to work and did not see a reason not to. I said, "All right." We set the concrete footers on a Thursday. June worked alongside me for 4 hours without complaining about the cold or the mud, or the fact that this was not particularly interesting work. She handed tools, held posts level, mixed the concrete in the small drum mixer Owen had, and at one point lay flat on the bank to clear a rock from under a footer without being asked. When we were done, she stood up and looked at the line of new posts and said, "That'll hold. Hold." I said I thought so too. She handed me back my level and walked toward the house without making anything of it. I stood by the fence for a moment after she left. The creek was calmer. The aspen on the ridge had lost most of their leaves. The valley was going into its quiet season, and the orchard rows were bare and still, and the mountains past the north ridge had snow on them already. I was thinking about June Alderman in a way I had not previously allowed myself to think about her, which was that she was someone I wanted to know more of. Not because she was useful, though she was. Not because she was good company, though she was that too. But because in the 4 hours we had spent setting fence posts in the cold mud, she had not once tried to be anything other than exactly what she was. And I had found that in a person to be increasingly rare and increasingly important. I said nothing about it. I went home and made supper and thought about it for a week. November came in cold and clear. I saw June at her parents' place twice that week and at the feed store once. We talked the way we had been talking, easily, and without effort. She told me the cold storage infrastructure grant had opened its application period. I said I had already seen it. She looked mildly pleased about that, in a way she tried not to show. One evening I drove over to return Owen's auger and found only June at home, Owen and Helen having gone to a neighbor's place for supper. She was in the kitchen making soup from what appeared to be the entire contents of the refrigerator. She looked at me when I came to the door and said, "Come in. I made too much." I stayed for supper. We ate soup at the kitchen table and talked for 2 hours. She told me about the work she had done in the years she had been away, the farms she had helped, the ones she had not been able to help, and why, the things that had made her decide to come home. She said it without sentimentality, just the plain accounting of a person who had thought it through and made a decision, and was comfortable with how it had come out. I told her about the years after my father died, the first picking season alone, the mistakes I had made, and what they had cost me. The slow process of learning to trust my own judgment on the orchard when there was no longer anyone to ask. I did not usually talk about those years, but June listened the way she did everything, directly and without filling the silences with reassurance. And that made it easier to say. When I finally stood up to leave, she walked me to the door. We stood on the porch in the cold dark for a moment. The stars were very clear the way they get in Montana in November, when the air is dry and sharp. She said, "I'm glad I came back." I said, I was glad too. Then I said it before I had finished deciding whether to say it, the way honest things sometimes come out before the cautious part of you can stop them. I said, "I think about you more than is probably sensible, given that we've only known each other properly for 2 months. June was quiet for a moment. Then she said, 2 months and 4 days. I looked at her. She said, I've been thinking about you since the harvest supper. I didn't say anything because you seemed like someone who needed to get there in your own time, and I didn't want to push you somewhere you weren't ready to go. I said, you could have said something. She said, you needed to say it first. You would not have trusted it otherwise. I stood on Owen Alderman's porch in the November dark and thought that she was probably right about that, and that she had understood something about me in 2 months that I had not understood about myself. I said, would you let me take you to dinner in town? She said, yes. She said it plainly, the same way she said everything. We went to dinner the following Friday at the one proper restaurant Millbrook had, a place called Harlow's that did good steaks and kept the lights low enough that it felt like an occasion without trying too hard. We talked for 3 hours. The waiter refilled our water glasses 4 times without either of us noticing. When we walked out into the cold street afterward, she put her hand through my arm naturally, without announcement, the way you do with someone you have already decided about. I walked her to her truck. She looked at me in the way she had looked at the fence posts, assessing and clear and entirely present. She said, good night, Thomas. I said good night. I drove home under a sky full of stars and thought that I had almost not gone to the harvest supper, and that this was the closest I had come in years to making a serious mistake without knowing it. We moved the way 2 working people move when they are trying to build something alongside lives that are already full of obligation. There was no sudden rush of it. There were dinners and long walks in the orchard rows in the early winter, when the trees were bare, and the frost was on the ground in the mornings, and the light came low and gold across the valley. There were evenings at her parents' table and evenings at mine. There were practical conversations about the grant applications and the co-op and the preserve operation that had started to expand in ways that needed proper accounting. There were also conversations that had nothing to do with any of that, about books and about the valley and about the particular satisfaction of work that you have chosen freely and do well. Owen shook my hand one Sunday morning after church and did not say anything. He did not need to. Helen started setting an extra place at the table without being asked, which I recognized as a form of acceptance more sincere than any speech. In February, June came out to the orchard on a cold, bright morning when I was doing the winter pruning. She walked the rows with me for 2 hours, watching what I cut and why, asking questions the way she always did, specifically and without pretending to know what she did. At the end of the row, she looked at the tree she had been watching me work on and said, you love this. I said yes. She said, it shows. She looked down the long row of bare trees in the winter light. She said, I want to understand it properly. The whole of it. Not just the business side. I looked at her. I said, then come out in April when the blossoms open. It's the thing you have to see to understand why a person would give their life to this. She said she would be there. She was. April came, and with it, the blossoms, the whole orchard white and pink against the mountains, the air thick with the smell that I had grown up inside of, and still could not adequately describe to anyone who had not stood in the middle of it. June walked the rows on the first morning of full bloom and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, I understand now. I said, good. She looked at me. She said, Thomas. I said her name back. She said, I'm not going anywhere. I want you to know that. I came home because this valley is where I belong. And I think you're part of where I belong. I'm not asking you to do anything with that today. I just wanted to say it plainly so you had it. I looked at her standing in the middle of the orchard in the April light with the blossoms all around her and thought about my grandfather planting these trees in 1961 and my father keeping them and me, keeping them after him, and how the whole of it had been an act of faith in a future that none of them could entirely see. I said, I'm not going anywhere either. She smiled. She had a good smile, not performed, just real, the kind that changed her whole face when she let it. I asked her to marry me in May, at the end of the east row, where the oldest tree on the property stood, a tree my grandfather had planted from a seedling he had brought from his father's farm in Idaho. It was gnarled and slow now, but it still blossomed every spring and still put out fruit in the fall, smaller than the others, but sweeter. My father had told me once that the oldest trees made the best cider because they had learned patience. I did not have a speech prepared. I had my grandmother's ring in my coat pocket, and what I said was what I actually meant, which was that I had spent 7 years learning to do hard things alone, and that June had shown me in one autumn and one winter that doing hard things alongside the right person was not weakness, but something better than what I had been doing. She said yes before I had finished the sentence. Owen cried at the kitchen table when we told him, which surprised me because he was not a man who cried easily. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and said, "I've been hoping for this since October." Then he looked at me and said, "You took your time." I said I knew. He said, "But you got there." Helen put her arms around June and then around me and said nothing at all, which was the right thing. We were married in September at the orchard, between the rows, on a clear evening when the apples were coming ripe, and the light was the particular gold that only happens in Montana in autumn, when the summer is finally letting go. Half the valley came. The tables were set with apple boughs and the last of the summer wildflowers. Helen made preserves as wedding favors. 12 varieties, with handwritten labels that took her 2 weeks to finish. Owen gave a short speech that made everyone laugh, and then made several of them cry. June wore a simple ivory dress and her work boots because the orchard ground was uneven, and she was a practical woman, and I loved her for it. I said my vows to her in plain words because she was a person who appreciated plain words. I said I saw her clearly, not only when she was competent and sure, but also when she was tired and uncertain, and I intended to be the person she could be uncertain with. I said the orchard had taught me that the best things take time and cannot be rushed, and that I was glad I had not rushed this. June's vows were short and direct, the way she was. She said she had come home looking for a place to put down roots, and had found instead a person worth staying for. She said she intended to stay. Then we were married. That evening, after everyone had gone and the lanterns were burning low in the orchard rows and the September night was cool and clear, we sat on the porch of the house that my grandfather had built, and my father had kept, and I had kept after him. June sat beside me with her shoulder against mine, looking out at the dark rows of trees. She said, "It's a good piece of ground." I said, "It is." She said, "We're going to do good work here." I said, I thought so too. The valley was quiet around us. The creek ran somewhere in the dark. The mountains were a black shape against a sky full of stars. I thought about my father dying in May in the middle of the picking season, and the years I had spent keeping this going alone, and the harvest supper I had almost not attended, and the woman sitting beside me who had understood me in ways I had not yet understood myself, and who had waited with the patient certainty of someone who already knew how the story ended. I put my arm around my wife. She rested her head on my shoulder the way the orchard rested in winter, quietly, without fuss, knowing that spring would come again, and that the work would continue, and that this was enough. This was everything, this small piece of ground, and the life we were going to make on it together. Some things grow slowly. The oldest trees make the best cider. My father was right about that. He was right about most things.